Maybe she will.
Okay. Good afternoon, and welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for coming on this gorgeous day, and I'd also like to welcome all of our online viewers. We appreciate it very much, and at the end of our conversation, I hope you won't hesitate to ask questions only from the audience that's here with us today at 432 Park Avenue. So again, thank you so much. And after this unexpected, long, and terribly sad interlude over the past 20 months, I'm certainly delighted to be back here in person at Phillips, especially in these extraordinary new facilities. And before I say anything else, I'd like to thank all of my colleagues here whose contributions of intellect, time, and energy has really made all of this possible. And I'm very proud of it, and I thank you all very much. And thanks everyone who's helping us to do this today. And I look forward beyond today in restarting the interviews, the panel discussions, and all the other programming in which I was involved at Phillips. The next project in which I'm involved is a graffiti exhibition which will open on January 6th, taking up, I think, almost all of this space, and with several programs during the exhibition and several online programs before that. So I hope you will all join us after January 6th and listen in for the programming. Today, however, I'm honored to be here to talk both about the history and the continuing relevance of my new book, Sensation, the Madonna, the Mayor, the Media, and the First Amendment. I always worry that I'm going to leave something out, which opened in the end of September at the Brooklyn Museum in 1999 and closed early in January of 2000. I'm also particularly honored to be joined today by Carol Vogel, a great journalist and writer I'm sure that you all know, and someone I've called a friend for very many years. Carol worked at the New York Times for almost 30 years, first as design editor of the magazine and later as an art reporter in the culture department, covering all art world news that needed covering. And for more than 20 years, she wrote Inside Art, a weekly column that I and most of the art world turned to first when opening the New York Times on Friday. We miss it very much. While now writing for the Times occasionally, Carol's presently focusing on her forthcoming book for Knopf, and I look forward to it, but I'm not getting any answers about it. Regarding Sensation, Carol was totally on target when she first wrote about the exhibition in Brooklyn on April 8, 1999, 6 months before the show opened. In her article, British Outrage Heads for Brooklyn, Carol presciently wrote, "Visitors to the Brooklyn Museum this fall may be in for a shock. Rather than sun-dappled impressionist landscapes or Rodin bronzes, its classical galleries will be filled with work by young British artists who have made a worldwide reputation for creating art that disturbs and outrages." She also published an interview. Chris O'Feely, British artist, holds fast to his inspiration when most other critics had mistakenly thought that O'Feely was not a critical voice. In that September 28 article, Vogel quoted a spot-on comment from O'Feely as his painting of the Holy Virgin Mary was the center of that storm. And I'm quoting O'Feely, "I don't feel as though I have to defend it," O'Feely said. "The people who are attacking this painting are attacking their own interpretation, not mine." O'Feely's final words in Carol's article were defining. "This is all about control," he said. "We've seen it before in history. Sadly, I thought we'd moved on." Before Carol and I get to our conversation and answer your questions afterwards, For those of you whose memories may not include many of the key issues of sensation, the exhibition, and now the book, I want to take just a few minutes to set the visual stage. In short, that's the book. In short, the book is about a brief but impossibly turbulent, highly significant, and supremely meaningful episode in my more than 4-decade-long career as an art museum director. It was similarly a critical moment for museums, cultural and educational organizations across our country whose missions were born in, nurtured on, and protected by the First Amendment and its right to freedom of expression. Artists, writers, playwrights, poets, journalists, and educators, all of us would be affected by the outcome of our 6-month journey through our federal court system. The title of the art exhibition that I brought to the Brooklyn Museum, and that's the catalog on the screen, was Sensation, Young British Artists in the Sochi Collection. It was organized by London's Royal Academy and featured the YBAs, or the Young British Artists, then the UK's most avant-garde artists. All 100 works in the Sensation came from advertising mogul Charles Saatchi's, Britain's most important contemporary collector, and that in itself would become an issue later on. My mandate in 1997, for those of you who haven't been to Brooklyn for a while, that's the museum, I was hired by Brooklyn Museum's trustees to move the museum rapidly into the 19th century into the 21st century from the 19th century, and to restore its leadership and museum community, and refocus its attention on the more than 3 million people who lived in Brooklyn, instead of primarily competing for visitors from Manhattan and beyond. Together with giving a higher visual profile to all of the great collections there, I relied on my own expertise in contemporary art to give the museum greater visibility and building on its long reputation for outstanding contemporary programming. At the Baltimore Museum, prior to Brooklyn, I had been working on a huge exhibition of treasures from the V&A in London, and with over 30 trips to London in just a few years, I had become immersed in the exciting contemporary art scene there. As soon as I heard about Sensation, I seized the opportunity for Brooklyn to become the only US venue for the exhibition, which of course became a huge hit both in London and in Berlin that followed. One painting, some of you may remember, or if you saw it at the Royal Academy, caused the Sensation exhibition to become an enormous controversy in London. It was a very large portrait made with the plaster models of children's hands of Myra Hindley, the Moor's murderer. In addition to Myra, which went without notice in Brooklyn, the exhibition's other works would be new, exciting, and often very provocative in New York, such as the Chapman sculpture of children with genitals in all the wrong places, or Dead Dad, a half-size nude male figure by Ron Muick of his father, or the self-portrait in the artist's own Frozen Blood by Mark Quinn, and perhaps most astonishing to visitors and most aggravating to the members of the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals were the works by Damian Hurst, such as this ferocious shark encased in hundreds of gallons of formaldehyde, or this cow sliced into a dozen sections, again in formaldehyde-filled cases. There had been outrage among the Royal Academy's elected artist members. The British tabloids, as you can imagine, had a field day. A Royal Academy member was quoted as saying, "Why should I go to the Royal Academy to experience mutilation, morbidity, perversion, and bestiality? I can get all of that at home." Despite the mostly negative media, or perhaps because of it, I witnessed thousands of young people in line every day to see Sensation at the Royal Academy. And here, in this image, I was certain that the Brooklyn Museum, it would be equally successful our rapidly changing millennial borough would welcome sensation with great excitement, enthusiasm, and equally long lines. I don't want to give away all the exciting details of the book because you need to read it to experience it. But for all of New York City, there was a totally unexpected painting in the exhibition that set off a firestorm that reverberated around the world through an avalanche of media. It is hard to imagine in these days of the internet and lightning speed communication, where each incident or outrage lasts for only a day or two, that the story of sensation was on the front pages of every newspaper and on television for over 6 months. The painting I mentioned was the Holy Virgin Mary, beautifully crafted and almost glowing with reverence by a young British-born Anglo-Nigerian artist, Chris O'Feely. O'Feely often used dry balls of shellacked and intricately decorated elephant dung in his work, in reference both to his African roots, where elephant dung was considered healing and life-giving. In the case of the Holy Virgin, the artist used a ball of elephant dung to present one of the Madonna's breasts, as you see here, again to refer to the life-giving and life-affirming nature of the material and of the Virgin Mary herself. Also, this almost life-size painting was not hung on the wall, but instead rested against the wall on 2 round feet of decorated elephant dung. And one day when I was in the galleries, 2 elderly white nuns visiting the exhibition introduced themselves to me and whispered how beautiful and how reverent the painting was to them. It was the one moment that I would never forget. That moment helped me to put aside the death threats against me, the bomb threats against the exhibition, and people attacking me in the street, on the subway, and especially in the press. The first media explosion came after the New York Daily News published a highly inflammatory piece about the show 3 weeks before it opened, with neither the reporter nor anyone from the newspaper ever having seen the exhibition. Even so, it was headlined, "Brooklyn Gallery of Horror, Gruesome Museum Show Stirs Controversy." That R-rated show, not to be outdone, the New York Post screamed, "Is this art? Butchered animals, a dung-smeared Mary, and giant genitalia spark outrage." The Catholic League, our bishop, and the cardinal denounced the painting. There were huge demonstrations outside the museum, both pro and con, and hourly coverage of the exhibition on cable TV. Congress debated the sensation exhibition and defunded it, although they had never funded it in the first place. Comedy Central and every late night TV featured the exhibition, and unfortunately me. But most seriously, the then mayor of New York, Rudy Giuliani, who was in an undeclared New York Senate race against Hillary Clinton, and also without seeing the exhibition, which was still several weeks away from opening, said that the O'Feely offended him, that the museum had to remove it, the painting of the Holy Virgin Mary, or he would demand the exhibition be canceled. And in short order, Giuliani proceeded, without authority to do so, to remove $7 million in operating funds from the museum. He also tried to replace the museum's obviously out-of-control board of trustees and director, and to evict the museum from its century-long city home. All this supposedly over one painting. However, it was a painting about which the publisher of the Amsterdam News, the largest black-owned and run newspaper in the country, that wrote as a headline, "A Black Madonna, Giuliani's Worst Nightmare." Speaking of the Amsterdam News, other than more local papers such as the News, Newsday, and the Village Voice, the major New York papers attacked the museum over and over with false statements that had almost entirely been thrown out of court. represented by the great constitutional lawyer Floyd Abrams, the Brooklyn Museum sued Rudy Giuliani, both in his capacity of mayor and personally in federal court, a process that took 6 months from filing to settlement. During those months, however, my bodyguard taught me defensive driving in the streets of Brooklyn. Every day, they tried to make me wear bulletproof vests, which I didn't because it made me look too fat. And instead of letting my office know immediately about a threat to blow up my car with me in it when I left the office, the note was sent to me via inter-office mail. More importantly, which arrived the next day. More importantly, the museum became the most talked about museum in the world. And lastly, the reason that people ask why I wrote this book, I wanted everyone to know that standing up for what is right, no matter what the cost, wins in the end. And I believe that, and I also believe that museums should be safe places for unsafe ideas throughout my entire career. There's much more of this discussion to come, but this is the end of the lawsuit when the city asked to end it. And so that's the old picture of Rudy, and that's the new picture of Rudy. More of the book with my friend Carol Vogel, your questions afterwards, and when you get a chance to read it. Thank you very much.
Yes, the new face of Rudy Giuliani is quite stunning, but when I was reading the book, I kept thinking, what was his ulterior motive? I mean, he wasn't such a devout Catholic that he would try to shut down a museum over a painting he never even saw. What do you think was really behind it all?
Well, you know, Carol, that's hard to say. And I must say, we've talked about it. I've talked about it with friends and museum folks for 20 years now. I mentioned the senatorial race with Hillary. I think by 1999, most of New York City was lost in terms of voting bloc for Giuliani. I guess maybe Staten Island was remaining and perhaps parts of Suffolk County. But he was after the conservative vote. And he was turning, we know because we know where the flyers were sent to about his defending the people of New York against this exhibition. He was after the conservative vote of upstate New York, which is heavily Catholic. And I think that is the only reason that makes sense, because I agree with you. He claimed, I'd like to believe, that this offended him, offended his religious beliefs. That's what I'd like to believe, but I cannot believe that's true.
Did he ever actually come to the museum and see the exhibition?
Never.
So the whole time during the entire court proceedings, he
Never.
never actually saw the Chrysophilia, he never actually saw any of it?
Never.
So it obviously was a political...
Well, what else do we have to turn to? I mean, what other, was it artistic?
Do you think in the end he did you a favor, Giuliani, by causing this stir?
Well, that's a great question. No one has asked me that question. Museums tend to anticipate the number of people that will visit a major exhibition. They figure out the number by the half hour, the hour, or by the day. And that tends to help security understand where they have to have their man and women power. And we more or less determined that we'd get about 170,000 visitors over the course of this time.
And how long was the museum? I mean, how long was the exhibition?
Open to the public on October 2nd, 99.
Right.
Closed January 6th.
So
it's 3 months. Right. 3 months, a normal run. And we also anticipated having the museum open a number of evenings, sometimes later hours. That all went into the mix, and it came up with 170,000 visitors. It was on 2 floors, and so when we did it, people walked slowly. There was also an audio guide, which tends to increase the length of a visit. At the end of all of this hullabaloo, we had 175,000 visitors. Now, part of that is that we didn't anticipate the number of visitors who would take 3 and 4 hours to go through the museum, who looked at everything incredibly carefully, who read every label, who sometimes were moved to tears by things, by many, many people who had never been to a museum before.
Did you ever do any research to find out if some of these first, because this was a year after remember when the Guggenheim did the motorcycles? And there were all
how could I forget?
Okay, and there were tattooed people who'd literally never been to a museum, but were motorcycle nuts. And they did a lot of research afterwards. Did you guys do research? Can you say that this really brought people into the museum who then came back to see contemporary art or impressionist art or something?
Well, we definitely know the number of new members that we got from this. We got an enormous number of new members, and I remember that my wife was online outside signing up new members because there were so many people. And
were they younger than the average?
There was a very young group. There were people from, I'd say, every borough of New York City, heavily there, Connecticut, New Jersey.
More diverse than the average Brooklyn Museum goer?
Well, that's another interesting question, because Brooklyn, by the time Sensation was on view, Brooklyn had somewhere already between 15 and 20% of its visitors were made up of people of color. You know, I always say location, 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 which is true. And we had huge educational programs. So there was there was a significant portion of visitors of color, but probably not up to 20%, which we often got for our daily visitation. But it was a very mixed crowd, very, very mixed. And we had a lot of visitors from Canada for some reason. We also asked people we got something like 18,000 written cards from people.
Comment cards.
Comment cards.
Were they asked to leave it at the end of the show?
Yes.
Okay.
They.
And what were they asking?
Well, everything. Mostly they were commenting about the exhibition. They commented about the idea. By now, they heard everything that was going on in the press. Many people talked about that they didn't want to lose the ability to come to the museum to see whatever they wanted. People commented about, as the next step, going to be books being taken out of the New York Public Library. There were a lot of very worried people making those kind of comments. Were there a lot of
people who came, repeat visitors, that you can identify?
One person came, I think, 9 times. Yes, there were many people who came 2 and 3 times.
And what was it that they were, was there one work of art that they would stand in front of longer than others?
I think we didn't have that research, but from my own observation, I went into the galleries every single day that I was in the building, and the work that I think occupied people the most was very interesting. It was Richard Billingham's photographs of his own dysfunctional family, and I think people had a great deal of understanding of what was going on in those photographs. And people stood there and cried. It's even hard to think about it. I mean, literally just stood, looked at these pictures, and cried. And stood there for an hour.
And it was unexpected because people didn't, there was so much attention.
Richard Billingham was 90s, I shouldn't say 90s, but was not in the top 10, 15, 20 works that people mostly talked about in the exhibition. But it did take up an entire wall that was 20 feet long in two directions, was in a corner.
No, I remember it.
The other, for different reasons, I think, was Dead Dad. People got on the floor all over, around the dead dad, I guess measuring themselves against this figure, trying to figure out if everything was proportional. There are a lot of works that brought people immediately to them, like the several works by Jake and Dinos Chapman, but most of those people walked away quite quickly. They were quite repulsed by what they were seeing, I think. And of course, the shark. The shark, there was the depth of visitors in that first gallery. They ignored, unfortunately, the Meyer Henley. They went right to the shark and stood around it 4 or 5 people deep, waiting to get closer.
This was the most difficult installation that the museum had ever done, and the most expensive, right? But there must have been some funny anecdotes that you could just tell. We won't repeat it, obviously, but you could just tell us.
Right.
That
For
happened.
all of our online visitors all over the world.
But that you could tell us. I mean, I know I've seen the shark being installed. That's a huge production.
The problem we discovered was whether we wanted to bring the shark in the formaldehyde already, which would be safer because it would be put into the case, which weighed, I think, something like 8 tons or 18 tons, British tons, which is more heavier than American, so about 20 American tons. Or would we be willing to take the shark and bring it alone and then fill up the case with formaldehyde afterwards? Well, the problem was that the shark in the case wouldn't fit in our gigantic freight elevator.
What about the weight of it, too?
Well, that was always an issue. I mean, we had engineers measuring everything in several areas for the exhibition. So we finally brought this shark completely wrapped in burlap and tarp, carried in by, I think, 6 or 7 people on some movable apparatus. And then it was hauled up and placed into the tank and filled with formaldehyde. Otherwise, we couldn't get it in.
And how long did that take, the installation take?
A whole day, just to bring the shark in. On the flip side of that, and everyone had to dress in what I would call hazmat
gear.
Suits
Yeah.
because of the formaldehyde. And we had to go to the city. The museum, I don't think, ever had to deal with the Environmental Protection Agency for a work of art previously. But we had to go there. And they said we didn't need a license. We thought we needed a license, but we didn't.
What about the blood?
Well, before I forget, because you asked for a funny incident. There weren't too many funny incidents, but the art handlers were opening up a very large crate, thinking that it was, I think, one of the Chapman Brothers pieces. But the crate simply had extra arms and legs in it. But we had all the arms and legs we needed. So we didn't know if these were extras, if people were going to pull the arms off of something or the legs.
Did you find out what they were for?
Never. No one knew. The Chapmans did. No one knew what the legs and arms were for. We packed them back up and sent them back to Charles. But we knew at least we had extra arms and legs. And let me get, you were asked a question.
Oh, the blood.
The Ron Muick blood head kept everyone up at night. It was delivered to us frozen, but on a British wiring, which we had to immediately change over. There are 2 little freezers in the bottom of the case, the pedestal, and one was an emergency, a freeze that went on when the other went off. and we had to rig up an apparatus, so like putting someone on life support, while we hooked it up to our American electrical system, and that was fine until almost at the end of the show. We never had a problem, although the alarm went off many times. At the end of the show, an alarm went off, and it was at night. And luckily, our head of security was there, rushed over, and so it was supposed to be set at minus 6 degrees, I guess Celsius, and rushed over, and both freezers were off. And we had an extra system that he hooked it up to immediately, and found, we did the next day, that someone who was doing work on the roof switched an electrical something that turned it off. We didn't even know that it was connected to it, but they didn't find that out until afterwards. Almost no one in the art handling or the registrar's office or me slept for those 3 months.
And it was terribly expensive, the installation, too.
Everything was much more expensive than we had anticipated. And one of the things I think it's important to say is that the agreement happened almost at the very end of the run in London, and so we had no budget. We were really unable to raise funds, either at the very beginning or throughout the run of the show, because it was Charles Saatchi's collection. Other collectors are not usually want to give you money to support another individual's collection. Corporations were pretty much afraid of it.
Sounds like other museums were afraid of it too. I mean, the Met didn't try to get it, and the Modern didn't try to get it.
The only other museum, our competition was the Guggenheim. And I think for monetary reasons, they, at the end, didn't do it. It was very difficult, and it was the revenues from ticket sales, catalog sales, sales from the gift shop, and the generosity of the museum's trustees that made this possible.
But you said in the end you didn't make any money from it. It broke even, right?
Well, it broke even because our trustees like to see balanced budgets. And so they were very generous in terms of making sure that we were not in the red or the yellow or whatever color by the end of the exhibition.
Really?
But we anticipated millions of dollars of court fees. And those were going to be charged if we won the case against Giuliani. And one of the reasons, in addition to his not wanting to be deposed, which the judge ordered after months of back and forth, was that he would have to pay the $6 million. So he settled, and we worked out an arrangement.
One thing that I found fascinating was the First Amendment was being attacked. The very nature of museums and their role in society and in the art world was being attacked. And yet, you suddenly became a bit of a pariah with some of your colleagues.
A bit?
I was being polite. I mean, Philippe de Montebello didn't come to your aid, nor did some of your other friends. Did that surprise you?
I think it wounded me more than it surprised me. I had really very strong relationships with almost every museum director, major museum director in the country. When I got to Brooklyn, I'd already been a museum director for 25 years.
Can you explain to the audience who haven't read the book yet, I don't think, what happened? Suddenly they weren't there for you. They were scared it might happen to them.
The New York City museums, and I think clearly the Met and the Modern, were particularly concerned that if they supported us, Giuliani would remove the funding that he was supporting. The Modern was in the midst of its $650 million campaign. Giuliani was giving the Modern 10% of that, $65 million. And the Modern, there's a group of institutions in New York called the CIGs, the Cultural Institutions Group, either in city-owned buildings, on city-owned land, which was supported, not entirely, but got support from the city, and particularly got capital support, which is what the $65 million was for the Modern. The Met, if I remember correctly, was promised something like $40 million. And that's a lot of money to make up once you feel that that's part of your treasure chest. And I think very much losing that monetary support was on the minds of some of our most immediate colleagues. It took a very long time before they came around.
They never stuck up for you in a way. In fact, they really distanced themselves on purpose.
Well, I certainly want to give Glenn Lowry credit, because at the beginning, I think he was very concerned about this, and there was a gag order. I had a lot of friends on that board of trustees, and there was a gag order that no one was to say anything. But at the end, Glenn stood up for the very issue of freedom of expression and said that many of these artists who people are just not giving much credit to now are going to be in every one of our museums. And so we should look at this with different eyes and support it. So,
and in the end, MoMA owns the Virgin Mary.
I mean, the very works of art that were most heavily criticized, the MoMA owns the Virgin Mary.
And the shark was at the Met.
That's even worse, because I had a conversation with my friend, the former director of the Metropolitan Museum, who was just saying how fabulous the shark looked there, and how the other works of art can be seen in concert with it, how you think about other works of art, seeing the shark in its own beautiful gallery. In the end, it was a loan from Steve Cohn, who owns it. But it was the new shark. We talked about it. It was the new shark, not the old shark. This shark got a lot of plastic surgery.
It was decaying, and they had to replace it. But
yes.
Do you think that Giuliani would have pulled the same kind of maneuver if Sensation had been at the Met, or if Sensation had been at the Modern? Did he have something about the Brooklyn Museum? Was there, or did he thought you guys
that's a really terrific question, and I appreciate it being asked. I don't think
I mean, would he have the nerve to attack the Met?
No, because I think it's the boards. People, you always think about the leadership of these museums and the curators, but people need to think about how important the boards of trustees are at various institutions. And you ask, why do we have X, Y, and Z? Why is the head of this corporation, and why is that, billionaire on here? It's because of the influence that they have in many different areas. I don't think this would have ever happened at the Met or the Modern, and maybe not even at the Guggenheim. But 2 months before the exhibition opened, on Bastille Day, which I'll never forget, I met with Giuliani. The president of our board and I met with Giuliani and his lieutenants to talk about, we had asked for $20 million to do the new entrance to the museum, which you saw on the screen. And we talked about everything back and forth. I started by talking about the Mets versus the Yankees, which probably didn't start off on a good foot because of Giuliani's support for the Yankees. But at the end, after showing him every provocative work in the exhibition, with the exception of the Holy Virgin Mary, because it never got any real publicity. either in London or in Berlin. It was never work that really made a splash. There was some little publicity about it, but nothing. I got 600 pages of printed publicity, newspaper articles, and so on. And it appeared 3 or 4 times. At the end of that discussion, the mayor patted me on the back, shook Bob Rubin's hand, and said to his lieutenants, give them what they want. They're good guys. So what changed? But we had a wonderful board, a board that stood with me every moment of this, but they weren't a board that could take down a mayor. And I think some of the other boards could do a lot of injury if they wanted to. So,
if you had to do this all over again, would you have done it differently?
well, I don't know if the health warning was up when you all came in. I wouldn't have done the health warning, which I wrote. I take credit or responsibility for that. It was meant as humorous, but it did encourage the Catholic League to go up and down the lines of visitors who were trying to buy tickets to the show and hand out vomit bags. It was, I think no one got the humor. Once we got into this fracas, no one really got the humor of it, and it became unnecessary annoyance. So I wouldn't have done that. I would certainly have shown the Holy Virgin Mary during in my slide carousel when I showed all the others to the mayor. And I say in the book that, we might have had it out right then and there. It was Bastille Day. Rather than a slap in the back, I might have had as they say, my head handed to me.
If you had shown it to him and he said, okay, fine, everything but take that out, what would you have done?
I would have said no.
So the whole fight would have started earlier.
Yes. But I think it would be better if we knew that we had that as the issue. Going into it, it changed. I mean, it started with the Holy Virgin Mary, but then it said our lease wasn't correct. Then the mayor went into that we weren't allowing children without guardians or parents, and on and on and on. Every time the courts started to knock something out, a new argument would arise.
And do you think this was just coming from him or from his whole support team as well?
It's Carl. That is so hard to answer.
And do you think he was enjoying all the press coverage that he was getting for it?
Yes.
Which just propagated more of it, more of it,
yes,
more of
because the more, ultimately, as we all remember, he was Mr. New York. He was America's mayor for 9/11. But he was, in a view of a number of very conservative people I knew who hated the exhibition and told me so. He was a hero. He was defending morality. He was defending community values. And he actually said, if I'm not going to defend this community, who else will defend it? And he accused me of Catholic bashing. I just went on. And every day there was something else.
Do you think the more that he saw in the press, the further he went?
Yes. Some people began to say this looks like, throwing things up against the wall, and the judge did. Right. The judge said, more or less, enough. None of this makes any sense. It's not of any value, and we're talking about a First Amendment issue here. We're not talking about whether or not your lease is correct.
There's something that's fascinating to me from an art perspective. Remember I said to you that I remembered when Rachel Feinstein was teaching at Yale, she told me that she used to do an exercise with her students where she'd say, look at 10 or 5 years ago's list of artists that are in a Whitney Biennial. How many of them do you recognize? So I got out my Sensation catalog and started looking at all the artists, and let me tell you, yes, they were all part of the YBAs, which they didn't want to be known as the Young British Artists. They didn't want to be part of this collective, but so many of them have gone on. I mean, forget just Damian Hurst and Chris O'Feely, but don't forget Jenny Saville was there, the Chapman brothers were there, Tracy Emin, Mona Hatoum. Do you think Sensation gave them that Kickstarter? Do you think they all would have been stars without it? Or is it impossible to say?
Well, I think it's impossible to say with certainty, but I would believe that their names were in the press constantly. Teams of TV crews were in the galleries constantly photographing. And I think between the real value that these artists, creativity that they had, and a number of really smart dealers who looked at this work.
They're internationally now. I mean,
Yes,
everywhere you go, you see
absolutely.
one or more of them over the years.
One person who was at the pre-opening and shaking everyone's hands was Jay Joplin. And you know, Jay has a great eye,
Well, he was right
and
there,
others,
too.
and he was right in the middle of all of this. And so I think the answer to your question is a number of really sustainable artists came out, not just of this exhibition, but were there in Great Britain. This brought much more exposure to them. No one in the United. There were several articles written when the exhibition opened in the Royal Academy in the Times. There was a big article by, oh, that's terrible. I should remember her name, but I think she was the London correspondent at that time.
Sarah Lyle was.
Yes,
yeah.
exactly. Someone has a good memory. No one paid any attention. You mentioned Sensation to people. They
But
knew
now
Damian
people
Hurst's
hear it.
name, and they knew Damian Hurst's name, and they knew Damian Hurst's name, and that's about it. And
yeah,
they
I mean,
knew
it's
almost all. And the others who are not remembered that well are still significant artists who sell work, who have careers. So I think for them the show is
And
very.
also, do you think Charles Saatchi's name translated here, I guess because he was the sole collector, but think how prescient he was. I mean, he put this whole group of artists' works together. He saw it ahead of time. And I mean, he was very involved, as you wrote in the book. Do you want to talk a bit about that? And having a collector in your galleries telling you how to be a museum?
The first thing I would say is that no one knew contemporary art in Great Britain better than Charles Saatchi. And probably I take a good chunk of Europe in that as well. He looked at art all the time, and
Had you known him before?
I met him,
But
but
you
I
didn't know.
didn't know him. But I remember that Nick Sirota, when he was the head of the Tate, said that Charles Saatchi personally sustained an entire generation of British artists. And I don't think he's wrong. He also was inextricably involved with his artists. And he was, for better or worse, inextricably involved with the installation of this exhibition.
Had he been that involved in Britain? Do you have any idea with the Royal Academy?
Well, he and Sir Norman Rosenthal
I can't say
chose
Norman
the exhibition from the
together.
collection. But you know, I'm going to have to ask that question. I don't really know the answer to that, but he was right there. I mean, he was literally a
Norman
few
was-
blocks away.
Was a fairly formidable guy with a vision of how something could be. I can't see the sort of Saatchi thing.
But they were friends.
But he came to, during Sensation, before Sensation, he came to New York and he was in your galleries every day. Do you want to
He was. We had all of our art handlers, our registrars, the conservators, curators, all working all day, every day for, 5 weeks, 6 weeks to get this installed. And Charles was there for, I would say, probably half that time.
You want to talk about the labels?
Kara's going to get me in real trouble.
Well, I want to get you in trouble.
No, I know. Charles, as many contemporary collectors do, hates labels, wants the work to speak for itself. And, I understand that. And in many contemporary museums and galleries, the works are all ganged together, the labels are all ganged together at the very end of the wall.
Or no labels at all,
labels
which
at
is
all.
the
You have to
worst.
go to the counter in a gallery at least, just see what they are. And Charles would say, labels are what catalogs are for. And I said, well, Charles, everyone doesn't buy a catalog. And he said, so print a, cheaper little catalog. Our initial compromise was that we were going to have large tented labels, a tented piece of paper, against the wall at the foot of a work of art. And I know that our former head of education, who then went on to be head of education for the Museum of Modern Art, had nightmares that as people were bending down to look at these tented labels on the floor, they'd be pushed by the people behind them, and everyone would be falling into the works of art, which I could share that nightmare. I think that,
Makes
not
sense.
at all far-fetched. And she absolutely, we all knew that wouldn't work. And when we printed those labels, we printed normal labels as well. And we put that up, and Charles was furious at me, absolutely furious. He, and I said, we want to return these works to you in at least the same condition that we received them, without damage. And this would cause enormous damage to, we believe, possible damage to the works of art. So we had that. It was a constant give and take about where works of art should be placed. I would say 95% of the time, maybe even a little bit more, he listened. And
Was there ever any interaction with Giuliani and Sochi?
oh, no. Charles left. He didn't even come to the opening. He left a week or so before the opening. He was not interested. The only interaction is the telephone calls I had from him about what is all this craziness, and but no, none. The only I don't know if you might ask a question like this, but the only interaction we had later was when you know what? I mistakenly didn't comment on the image of when the painting was vandalized. It went by my head so quickly. The only conversation I had with him was almost at the end of the exhibition when the painting was vandalized. I finally...
That was the only painting that was...
Yes, absolutely, nothing. Only that.
And you had taken great pains to make sure this wouldn't happen.
Where it had originally been placed was on a long wall with the other Ophelies, because we felt that if you understood what was going on in the other Ophelia paintings, it would help to understand what was taking place in the Holy Virgin Mary. But our chief of security felt very strongly that it had to be better protected. So we had a small alcove, and we moved the painting into the alcove. Our chief of security and head conservator ordered the biggest piece of plexiglass in the world, the biggest piece I've ever seen, which was about 20 feet high and 16 or 18 feet wide, which they hung from the ceiling in front of it. And it was one of those plexis that doesn't distort, so it probably cost more than the painting did at the time. And we had a guard standing there the entire time the museum was open, one guard. And we had guards moved around for the rest of the exhibition. In any event, the person who did who vandalized the painting feigned a heart attack And the guard, who was very sympathetic, went to get him a glass of water. And at that moment, he slipped through I couldn't slip through it, but he did, this very narrow passage between the wall and the plexi, and in his pocket. So he got through the metal detectors. We had to actually install metal detectors at the entrance to the museum. He had carried this white paint in a plastic container so it wouldn't be caught in the metal detectors. And he went up immediately and squirted it all over the face, primarily.
You got right to conservation when it was still wet.
And
so
he stopped, and conservation was there, I would say, in 2 or 3 minutes. They had it off the wall.
You were lucky.
And very lucky, because if the paint had dried, they wouldn't be able to have.
You didn't screen your visitors like today. They didn't have to open their bags or.
Well, they went through a metal detector. Well, believe me, this is hard to imagine. I can't imagine what our visitors carried with them before we had metal detectors. People had hammers and screwdrivers and box cutters. We had boxes and boxes of metal stuff that I don't know if people in New York City carry with them regularly. I don't usually carry a hammer with me or a box cutter, but maybe they thought the museum was a dangerous place. And I don't believe any of them were there to create a problem.
That's what I was going to ask you.
No. But, oh, I'm sorry, they say to a guard, I forgot that this box cutter was in my Chanel bag. It didn't make a lot of sense. No, but so, yes, they got the painting. They removed 99 point, there were only microscopic things left. But I finally got Charles Sochi in Thailand after a day of trying to get him. I couldn't get Chris O'Feely, and I couldn't get Sochi.
I remember talking to Chris O'Feely.
And after hours of and I can't remember, was I still in the hospital? My wife was there. Or I had just gotten home. I had an abdominal operation. So I was doing this. I was told that the painting was vandalized while I was in the hospital. I got home the next day and I had to speak to Charles Sochi. And we reached an agreement that we'd add an additional guard, and that no matter what happened, that painting was to be returned to him before anything else was returned.
And was it?
Yes. Yes. It went immediately. Because he had called, or someone in his office had called an art truck company to come and pick it up without telling us. And that wouldn't have happened. But as did his dealer, as did Chris's dealer. That's a whole other story, which I'm not going to get into.
We should do questions and answers yet? Or?
Are we all finished?
Well, I just think, I don't know.
Okay. But these are such good questions. Yes. Questions for Carol.
Yes.
There's a microphone over there. If you don't mind, a standing mic.
I'll speak up.
Okay, please. Maybe if you stand up, everyone can hear you. Okay.
Okay, just wanted to ask you, without Sochi, would you ever have put on this show, Ophelia show?
Just a
Was
show.
Sochi
Okay, the
responsible?
question is, if Saatchi hadn't
Promoted?
produced this show and had it at the Royal Academy, would we have ever done an exhibition of the young British artists or of Chris O'Feely?
Of Chris Ophelia.
I would have probably done an exhibition a little later on of Chris O'Feely. I knew the work, but I wasn't intimately familiar with it. But the more I saw the work, I would have certainly done an exhibition. I mean, I don't do exhibitions, our curators do them. So.
Sochi promoted so many artists. He bought everything, because I know it as a fact, because I was around in those days.
Oh, he did?
He did. I mean, I would go to the Terry Winters exhibit, and then they told me Saatchi just bought out the whole show. So he was a promoter.
Well, I have to disagree with you. I don't think Charles was a promoter. I really don't. Charles was one of the most avid collectors I've ever met. He bought, if he liked an exhibition, he bought it all. If he liked an artist's work, he bought 20
But
of them.
sensation obviously helped the value, and then he sold them later.
And then he put it all back into auction, because I remember Lucy Mitchell Innes, who was head of Sotheby's, said, as soon as there's an auction, all of Saatchi's works goes right into the auction.
Yeah, but that's not true.
That's not true?
Saatchi sold a great deal of work of certain artists.
He ruined a lot of artists.
He did. He sold a great deal of work of certain artists, but I'm not Charles's defender, believe me. But Charles said, I've been collecting work for 30 years, and masses of work. And I want work that's cutting edge. I want work that's new and fresh. And to do that, I have to sell work that isn't new and fresh. You can agree with that, you can disagree with that, but I wouldn't use the word promoter as the first word about Charles Saatchi. And we had a lot of problems, but I still respect that I think on average, he did a lot more good for British artists than he did damage. He sold a lot of Italian artists' work early on, but we never talked about them. But he did sell a lot of work, there's no question. David.
What kind of comparison you did?
A little louder. Oh, here's the microphone.
With the present Guston situation, do you see any comparison in censorship?
Definitely.
Well, Carol just said definitely, and I would certainly. You want to speak to that, or?
No, you speak.
I think when we talked about the relevance of this exhibition today, I think American museums, universities, and other institutions, one of the problems we're facing is a lot of self-censorship that, for many different reasons, probably none of them good, we're not necessarily seeing things that we should or could or want to. With the Philip Guston exhibition, I would have to say, and the people who were involved are friends of mine, I wish they had thought it all through early on.
Don't you think, though, that they're underestimating the sophistication of the audience?
Of course, always.
I mean,
I
they're
always
dumbing
think our audiences are more sophisticated or innately understand. I mean, that's what the greatness of artists are. They can speak to a lot of people in different ways. And I do think they do underestimate that. And I think I was just very sad about the whole Guston situation from the beginning until where it is now. A great artist that it just wasn't planned well to begin with.
Which exhibition? The one at Hauser and Wirth?
No, the National Gallery
The
exhibition.
National Gallery was with two other
Yes.
institutions.
The other question is, do
There
you
was
think
someone
that
right here. Were you asking a question before? I did have a question. Go ahead. Can you, for the moment, do you mind taking off your mask because I can't hear you?
The Renee Cox as Young Novice last summer, is that at the same time as this?
I'm glad you're a visitor to the Brooklyn Museum or you read the New York Post, one of the two.
Or both.
Or both. No, the exhibition called 100 Black Photographers was a year later. And if others don't remember this was I think, a terrific exhibition covering about 50 years of African-American photography. Renee Cox, who was a very good and very lively photographer and who I was friendly with, did a a version of The Last Supper in which she portrayed herself as a nude woman Christ figure. The issue that came up with that exhibition is that when it was installed, I mean, I don't install exhibitions. I do comment, but I don't install them. And it was on a wall as you walk through the galleries, and I thought, speaking of self-censorship, you know, maybe we want to give people a choice before they see this picture. So we happened, I always find little alcoves. We happened to have a small gallery right off one of the main galleries, and we reinstalled the Rene Cox in that gallery and used what we use at the museum all the time that says parents or guardians should preview exhibitions before taking children, period, nothing else said. And the newspapers, at least the Post and the Daily News, I think, went on and on about that I had installed this to in a chapel of its own to give it even more significance than it had. I plead not guilty to that, but I do plead guilty to giving people a choice right after sensation in whether they wanted to see it or they didn't want to see it. You couldn't miss it. You had to walk by it anyway. It just was another 10 feet further away.
I didn't know. Thank you for that. And I'm sorry if that was uncomfortable. I'm sorry if that was uncomfortable because I didn't know that. I just thought Giuliani had come for that. I thought Giuliani had come for that exhibition as well.
No, there's some murmurs from the city, but nothing really happened. Yes, back there.
I remember also that Giuliani had set up some kind of morality board at the time, and I remember one character.
A rally?
A morality type of board. I remember there was this one
yes.
character,
Well,
Raoul
you are
Lionelfelder.
absolutely right. Thank
What
you.
was the deal with that? And then secondly, you know, you don't sign as a museum director. You don't sign up for death threats and being in the newspapers all the time. So I'm curious, psychologically, emotionally, what were you going through as well?
Those were all in my contract when I signed it. Thank you for reminding me. The other thing that did happen with the Rene Cox exhibition is Giuliani formed what was called his decency panel. And
who was on it?
you know, there are a number of people who were, I don't remember the names, but a number of people who kind of mattered in the city of New York. I think a number of them didn't know they were appointed to the Decency Council, but it was announced and it faded in a couple of months. No one really, this is New York, and the least sophisticated person going to a museum in New York is among the most sophisticated people in the world. And it's just, that was one of the real issues that we all had with this, and that the critics, Giuliani's critics had, that it was so embarrassing for New York City to have such a nonsensical thing as this that had to be a federal lawsuit to gain permission for people to see a work of art. So the long and short answer to your question before, I would do it all over again. I wouldn't do it 20 years later, but I would do, if I was still a museum
later, I don't
director.
think it would resonate in some way.
No, it would. I mean,
be
people would probably enjoy it. There are probably a lot of young people who
different. But it would have been.
don't remember sensation and may not know many of these artists. And all of these artists deserve recognition. They're
a lot of them are getting
yeah,
it now.
Yes.
In a very different context.
Very different context. And we have a different mayor, and a different city council. I should say, the city council, to a person, stood up for this exhibition. And the speaker of the council, who was a very devout Catholic, spoke up not for the exhibition, but for the freedom of everyone in New York City to be able to see this. You know, you vote with your feet. So there was another question back there, and then we'll let everyone go and look at this gorgeous show and buy some books. No? Yes, thank you.
Part of my ignorance of
Hold on for 1 second.
this is kind of a government question. I remember this whole thing, and I was just personally horrified by it. But in retrospect now, I'm just like, because you mentioned the city council, it's like, really, does one person in our city government, the mayor, get to decide what happens to public money and can just, like that, say, the $6 million we promised to the museum, now you don't get it? I mean, I was a little confused by that. I mean, nobody else in the government was on his side, and now that, thank goodness, I'm glad to hear the city council spoke up against it. I mean, I thought it was just a whole publicity thing. I never really knew that there were all these lawsuits and everything else. I mean, he could just write you out of the city budget?
Well, Giuliani, in fact, did not have authority to remove the $7 million from our budget. I mean, we saw the checks come in, and it was gone. He didn't have authority. That authority is the city council's authority. But if you remember that administration, a lieutenant of Giuliani's was heading up every part of the city government, more or less. And when he said, remove $7 million from their budget, it was gone. The city council was going to sue to get the money back. But before that, we had our lawsuit, and finally, when the Court of Appeals said that they would take it under advisement, and we immediately heard that the district court, the federal district court, had determined that we'd get a permanent injunction against Giuliani. It was over. And we just wrangled through the settlement details.
So basically, he exceeded his authority, and the court, all the lawsuits were about making sure he didn't get away with it?
No. I just want to make this short as an answer. It was clear, at least clear to me, and clear to all of the First Amendment lawyers who were in the courtroom when the Court of Appeals, the last thing that was said to Giuliani's attorneys from the Corporation Counsel's office. Now remember, this is city attorneys being paid by your money. When the chief judge of that three-person panel said to the lawyer, and you are still maintaining that this is a landlord-tenant dispute and not a First Amendment issue. Oh. That is what you maintain. And the lawyer said, yes, Your Honor, that is our position. And I don't remember, was that judge or one of the other judges said loudly enough, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my 20 years on the bench. At which point they adjourned, and he said, we'll tell you our opinion as soon as possible. And I think we got a call that afternoon.
Thank you.
First, I want to thank Carol, who did, this is out of friendship, and I appreciate it very much. So thank you.
So many details. Thank you.
And I want to thank all of you. This is such a gorgeous day. I said to Carol earlier, I wouldn't go to a talk on a day like today. Maybe one of the last ones we have this fall. So thank you very much. I want to thank all of our online viewers. who really appreciate your tuning in no matter what time it is, wherever you are. And I hope you come again. And if you have a chance, this is an extraordinary photography exhibition. I hope you have a chance to look at it. So thank you all very, very much.